people get an incredible amount wrong about North Korea, but I think the critical factor that we do as Americans is we fail to understand the indigenous and nationalist roots of Korea itself. It's really easy to lump Korea, back in the Cold War days, it was that they were part of this unified communist bloc in which they were just the puppets of China or the Soviet Union. But even after the fall of the communist bloc, we developed this view of North Korea that said either they're just crazy and deranged and hence can't be understood, or they're still just dancing to the Chinese tune. And we see that now all the time in policymaking circles. President Trump and members of his administration talk about how the answer is always China. And I shouldn't single out the Trump administration because this is something that goes back for decades. And yet the reality is North Korea is its own nation with a long history of traditions, values, ideology, and we need to start taking them seriously on their own merits. Now that doesn't mean we necessarily have to approve of them or accept them. And I'll be the first to say that when this regime is gone, which is one of the worst in world history, that'll be a terrific moment. But we have to at least accept them as an independent state and negotiate with them and treat them based on their own history and their own values rather than looking for these easy solutions.
Do we have to do something right now? Is this a crisis?
So it's been a crisis for decades. The question isn't so much, should we do something right now? Do we have to do something right now? The bigger question is, can we do something right now? The consequences of a military strike on the Korean Peninsula are so devastating that they can't be taken seriously. Anyone who launches I don't think that a war is going to come to Korea just because the consequences would be so devastating. What could happen is something could spiral out of control. No one's going to sit down and say it's in the strategic best interest of the United States or Korea to go to war. But as we've seen in the 20th century, war doesn't always work that way. And sometimes, particularly with two somewhat unpredictable and inexperienced leaders at the helm, things could spiral out of control. I would argue that the best thing that we can do right now is simply to wait. There are signs, and I know we've been saying this for a while, but there are signs of the penetration of North Korean society by Western culture because of the new technological advances. There's also signs of growing sense of capitalism, of markets. There is a slowly emerging market-based system in North Korea. We call it the Jangmadang generation. That was really created out of the great famines in 1994 when the food distribution system in North Korea broke down, and it forced the North Korean people to start setting up these small markets. And so we've now reached the point that there's a growing generation, an emerging generation in North Korea that is starting to accept the values of trade and free market and starting to question the idea that the only way you can get ahead is through subservience to the great Kim family, and is starting to change their notion, their understanding of the outside world based on flash drives and phones and other things that are being smuggled in that has TVs and movies and music from the West. So at the moment, it's not that we have many good options, we have no good options, but the best one is probably to wait and let this play out, because any more dramatic action in a military sense is going to be devastating.
So we've got one of these ironic consequences. If we really push hard, we could have a devastating problem.
And it's hard, right? We as Americans, American policymakers, particularly in our democratic system, they don't want to just wait. And especially President Trump, who came to power talking about how this would never happen. And it's no doubt instinctive that they want to reach out and strike. They want to do something. And the reality is we've been dealing with this for decades. North Korea is a rational state. The regime is awful, but they like life and they live very comfortably. And so right now I think the best thing that we can do is nothing, even while sort of our democratic system sometimes encourages against that.
Last question. Do you think that it is Kim's ambition to unify the Korean Peninsula?
So we just had a really good discussion about that in the last panel. And there's two really different school of thoughts. There are, and we had that in the panel. There's one argument that says this is primarily for defensive or internal purposes, and the other that says his ultimate objective is to unify the peninsula. No one really knows. I guess I would say to some extent both are at work here. I don't doubt for a second that Kim's ultimate goal is to unify the peninsula. This has been the goal of the Kim family for 3 generations. And I don't doubt that when he feels comfortable with the idea that he can actually strike the United States, he will use that as a diplomatic bargaining
blackmail.
And try to, in some way, force out American troops, or there's even talk, the rumors are that he might use this as a way to try to open negotiations with the South to lead to some sort of long-term confederation. But whatever it is, that I don't doubt that he's going to use it to try to drive out American influence in the peninsula. But I think the consensus from the panel also was that that's pretty unlikely to happen. And I think that there is a legitimate sense inside the North Korean government that in order to avoid the Iraq example or the Libya example, they need this primarily for defensive purposes, and what it will give you as an offensive weapon in terms of negotiations is just kind of gravy.
I think the most important thing that we're getting wrong is overlooking our allies in this, especially South Korea. I think it's very unsettling to the South Koreans that when we talk about the crisis, we seem to only mention them as the prospective casualties of a North Korean counterstrike, or actually as something that we might actually sacrifice for our own security guarantees. I mean, that is the message that Senator Lindsey Graham sent not once but twice last year when he said a war on the Korean Peninsula would be terrible for the Chinese, it would be terrible for the Japanese, it would be terrible for the South Koreans, but it would not be so bad for the Americans because it would be over there, better over there than over here. Well, the South Koreans are a treaty ally of ours, the Japanese are a treaty ally of ours, and they also have a sense of grievance against the United States. They don't feel like the United States has always done right by them necessarily, and talk like that only causes them to fundamentally question their relationship with the United States and makes them wonder, would the Americans possibly trade us for some sort of deal with the North Koreans? It's very unsettling.
What possible grievances could South Korea have? We've had tens of thousands of troops over there protecting them all these decades.
Yeah, it's something that actually goes back to the very genesis of U.S.-Korean relations. In 1882, the U.S. and Korea signed a treaty, one clause of which contained a good offices clause, which meant that if another party, a third party, dealt unjustly with either nations, the United States was obligated to extend good offices. Now, good offices is a technical legal term from Western jurisprudence. There was no comparable term in the East Asian context. So when this treaty was translated, the South Korean, or sorry, not the South Koreans, the Kingdom of Chosun actually thought that it had an alliance with the United States. When the Japanese occupied Korea in 1904 on their way to colonizing it, they asked the United States to make good on that treaty, and the Americans did not, because from their perspective there was no treaty. And this, right at the beginning, set up the stage for a whole nother series of grievances. The division of Korea, when the United States divided Korea. This was supposed to be a temporary division, to be sure, but there's no doubt it was an American idea. The United States withdrawal from Korea in 1949 without giving Korea's explicit security guarantees, despite the Koreans warning them, if you don't do something, if you don't give us these guarantees, there's a good chance the North is going to invade. And then it just builds from there. I mean, there's a long history of confrontation between American troops and South Koreans blowing up into these incidences of rabid anti-Americanism, especially in 2002 and 2008. This is so obscure in the United States, yet it's so personal to the Koreans, and there's a possibility these incidents could happen again.
If you were looking into your crystal ball, anticipating future consequences, suppose war did break out. Is Seoul a goner?
It's almost too terrible to contemplate, but that is a definite possibility. But I think there's a whole subset of possibilities that's being overlooked, and one of them would be that not a preemptive or preventative strike against North Korea actually would not result in a North Korean kinetic response. The North Koreans would not shoot, but rather what they would point out to their ethnic kin in the South is that the United States had just been willing to roll the dice with tens of millions of Korean lives hang in the balance, and ask the South Koreans very politely, who is the greater threat to peace and security on the Korean Peninsula? Is it the United States? Now, not even a majority. I don't know how many South Koreans would buy this. Certainly not a majority. But there are some that would. There are progressive NGOs and politicians who have made their careers opposing the American presence in South Korea. And there would certainly be Koreans on the streets demonstrating very strongly and demanding that the U.S. leave. Now, could the U.S.-ROK relationship, could it survive such an outbreak? There's a good chance that it could, but there's also a good chance that it might not.
And the consequences of a real problem in South Korea and North Korea is the destabilization of the whole area, right? Definitely. I mean, one of the underdeveloped storylines of this whole crisis is the way it's affecting Japanese society. The way Japanese are talking for the first time in decades about revising their constitution to change the clauses that make them officially a pacifist state. They're talking about creating for the first time a conventional army that has
the capabilities of projecting power outside of the Japanese islands. This is deeply, deeply destabilizing to South Korean society, to China, and it really has unforeseen consequences going forward. It could be in 40 years' time, we look back and see that actually the crisis over North Korean nuclear weapons was actually not the most significant thing. It was actually all the fallout with our relationship with our allies that was more consequential.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.